Most agree that the Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth in 1620 were undoubtedly Christians who built their cities and schools based on the teachings of the Bible. Yet 150 years would pass before the United States was founded as a result of the American Revolution. Our journey begins with the Revolutionary Era and by examining the philosophies and beliefs of the men who were the chief influence in the founding of the new American Republic. While often overlooked or marginalized by modern historians, the American Revolution in many ways begins with Thomas Paine. The Marquis de Lafayette said, "A free America without her Thomas Paine is unthinkable." Thomas Paine wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, and it is stated, if you study historians relate that the pamphlet Common Sense was the writing that brought about the Declaration of Independence. In fact, Thomas Paine uses that phrase in Common Sense. Paine wrote that nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration for independence. What's interesting is that Thomas Paine at that point was not even an American citizen. He was an Englishman. He was in England, and he met Benjamin Franklin. And he was a radical guy, and he was a writer, and Franklin liked his writing style. Of course, Benjamin Franklin was a well-known printer. And so Franklin wanted Paine to come to America and encouraged him to write down his ideas in some kind of a pamphlet or a book or something. And so that's what inspired Paine. You know, it was Franklin who got Paine here into America and then helped him and encouraged him to write Common Sense, which he did. And he penned it and published it anonymously, so nobody knew who it was. And then they found out later on that it was him. Of course, he becomes very famous. Paine also published the Crisis Pamphlet series, which were read aloud by George Washington to his troops. On Paine's tombstone is written that Common Sense was the pamphlet that stirred the American colonies to independence. It reads that John Adams said, "Without the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington would have been wielded in vain." Then below it reads, "History is to ascribe the American Revolution to Thomas Paine." So right there on his tombstone, they're openly ascribing the American Revolution to Thomas Paine and saying that at a literary level, at the level of setting forth a philosophy and the ideas, Paine's contribution was equal to that of George Washington, really. Based on John Adams' quote, "Without the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington would have been wielded in vain." In other words, you needed Paine's philosophy and then Washington's military skills, and that's what brought about victory, supposedly, for the American Revolution. Paine was also the first to coin the phrase, the United States of America. His influence is undeniable. But why has he been marginalized by modern historians? The answer, almost certainly, is because once the revolution was over, Paine then published his true thoughts about Christianity and the Bible, The Age of Reason. He wrote, "When I see throughout the greater part of this book, the Bible, scarcely anything but a history of the grossest vices and a collection of the most paltry and contemptible tales, I cannot dishonor my Creator by calling it by his name." While some have accused Paine of being an atheist, his defenders are quick to point out that he most certainly believed in a God, just not the God of the Bible. What's powerful and disturbing is that Paine comes right out and he addresses and attacks the gospel itself. He says, literally, "It is the fable of Jesus Christ, as told in the New Testament, and the wild and visionary doctrine raised thereon, against which I contend." And then he goes on to say that the story, taking it as it is told, he says, is blasphemously obscene. The so-called obscenity Payne refers to is the virgin birth of Christ. He said, "What is it the Testament teaches us? To believe that the Almighty committed debauchery with a woman engaged to be married, and the belief of this debauchery is called faith." So he's specifically denouncing, as all of the Enlightenment thinkers did, the supernatural elements of the gospel story. He's denouncing the virgin birth of Christ. He's ultimately going to denounce the idea of the resurrection, and so on. The title of Payne's book, The Age of Reason, is very telling, because really what he's describing is the belief of the Enlightenment thinkers in Europe. And what they did in France, with the French Revolution, the French Freemasons, they took the goddess of reason and they exalted her on a throne. Now, this was well known even centuries before. If you read the Geneva Bible and the footnotes in the Geneva Bible, the 1599 edition, they talk about how the pagans would enthrone the goddess of reason, and the idea being that reason would govern, just like a god, reason would govern your understanding of things, whatever it was. And the way that they applied this to the Bible is that if anything in the Bible did not seem reasonable, according to the powers of human reason, then it should be rejected. And the one thing that most of them pointed to was the virgin birth of Christ. Does it seem reasonable that a girl who has never been with a man should suddenly get pregnant? And they would say, well, no, that's not reasonable. And because it's not reasonable, therefore they would reject it. Thomas Paine wrote, "I do not believe in the creed professed by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church." Paine openly wrote that he detested the Bible and said it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God. Well, this thing sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and the American people saw what Thomas Paine believed, and immediately they thought, wait a minute, Thomas Paine, he was close to George Washington, he was close to Thomas Jefferson, he was close to Benjamin Franklin, and so on. If this is what Paine believes, is this what the rest of the founders believe? To greater or lesser degrees, the philosophy of reason influenced most of the revolutionary founders. This is what inspired John Adams to write, "When philosophical reason is clear and certain by intuition or necessary induction, no subsequent revelation supported by prophecies or miracles can supersede it." It was this dedication to human reason that inspired Thomas Jefferson to write, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," in the Declaration of Independence. These words were engineered to specifically reject the idea of biblical revelation or prophecy that comes from heaven as the authority of human government. Instead, the new American Republic would be governed only by the philosophic understanding which is self-evident in the minds of men. While most of the revolutionaries held views similar to those of the Enlightenment thinkers, it was Thomas Paine who wrote about them most openly. Thomas Paine not only denied the gospel, but hoped that the age of reason would ultimately get rid of it. He said, "The Christian theory is little less than the idolatry of the ancient mythologists, and it yet remains to reason and philosophy to abolish the amphibious fraud." In spite of all that Thomas Paine had written against Christianity, Moncure D. Conway, Paine's biographer, said this about him: "His attack on Christianity was indeed directed at the gross corruptions of it. If one studies the founders carefully, it becomes clear that their ideas of the Christian religion had more to do with a moral code of conduct than faith in Jesus Christ." In other words, the religion that many of them refer to is not Christianity at all. Jefferson is one of America's most important founders, the man who drafted the Declaration of Independence. He is often featured prominently by those who argue that America was founded on Christian principles. But his own letters make it clear that he had no great love for Christianity or the Bible. Jefferson, much like Thomas Paine, and they were good friends, not only did not embrace Christianity, but he made it his business to denounce Christianity at every turn. And at best, he encouraged people toward unbelief and doubt and so on. In a letter to General Alexander Smith on January 17, 1825, Jefferson was commenting on the book of Revelation. He said, "It is between 50 and 60 years since I read it, and I then considered it as merely the ravings of a maniac, no more worthy nor capable of explanation than the incoherences of our own nightly dreams." Through the rest of his letter, Jefferson makes it clear that he had not repented of this view. Some have tried to whitewash Jefferson because supposedly he thought Jesus was a fine teacher of morality. But here is what he actually said. "The greatest of all the reformers of the depraved religion of his own country was Jesus of Nazareth, abstracting what is really his from the rubbish in which it is buried is easily distinguished by its luster from the dross of his biographers, and as separable as the diamond from the dunghill." There are quotes where Jefferson is denouncing the Old Testament. There are quotes where Jefferson is denouncing the New Testament. Concerning the Old Testament, Jefferson wrote, "Where get we the 10 Commandments? The book indeed gives them to us verbatim, but where did it get them? For itself tells us they were written by the finger of God on tables of stone, which were destroyed by Moses. But the whole history of these books is so defective and doubtful that it seems vain to attempt minute inquiry into it. And such tricks have been played with their text and with the texts of other books relating to them, that we have a right from that cause to entertain much doubt what parts of them are genuine." In the same letter to John Adams, he writes, "In the New Testament, there is internal evidence that parts of it have proceeded from an extraordinary man, and that other parts are of the fabric of very inferior minds. It is as easy to separate those parts as to pick out diamonds from dunghills." When one reads the Jefferson Bible, it becomes clear what Jefferson was referring to when he mentioned dunghills. What he does in his Jefferson Bible is he specifically omits all of the supernatural elements of the Gospels. He omits the virgin birth of Christ. He omits the miracles that Jesus performed. Obviously, he omits the resurrection of Christ and so on, his ascension into heaven. Anything that was contrary to the philosophies of reason that had been set forth, he pushes out of his representation of the New Testament. And he not only omits those things, but in his letters, he denounces them in the most derogatory language you can imagine. Concerning Jesus himself, Jefferson wrote, "Among the sayings and discourses imputed to him, I find many passages of fine imagination, correct morality, and of the most lovely benevolence, and others, again, of so much ignorance, so much absurdity, so much untruth, charlatanism, and imposture. I separate, therefore, the gold from the dross, and leave the latter to the stupidity of some and roguery of others of his disciples. Of this band of dupes and impostors, Paul was the first corrupter of the doctrines of Jesus." From his letter, there's the quote from Thomas Jefferson to his nephew, Peter Carr. You will next read the New Testament. It is the history of a personage called Jesus. Keep in your eye the opposite pretensions. One, of those who say he was begotten by God, born of a virgin, suspended and reversed the laws of nature at will, and ascended bodily into heaven. And 2, of those who say he was a man of illegitimate birth, who set out without pretensions to divinity, ended in believing them, and was punished capitally for sedition by being gibbeted according to the Roman law. These questions are examined in the books I have mentioned. They will assist you in your inquiries. But keep your reason firmly on the watch in reading them all. Paine's good friend, Thomas Jefferson, far from trying to establish a Christian nation, said he hoped the gospel itself would be destroyed in the New World. He compared the gospel to the ancient mystery religion of the ancient world. He said it was basically a spin-off of the ancient mystery religion. In a letter to John Adams, Jefferson wrote, "And the day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by the Supreme Being as his Father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter. But we may hope that the dawn of reason and freedom of thought in these United States will do away with all this artificial scaffolding and restore to us the primitive and genuine doctrines." One of the most influential revolutionary fathers, the man known as a scientist, a patriot, and a spy, was Benjamin Franklin. Sir Walter Isaacson said that Benjamin Franklin was the most accomplished American of his age and the most influential in inventing the type of society America would become. This is very significant when one considers the direction America has taken since the time of the Revolution. Franklin is one of the most significant founding fathers. He was the only founder who signed all of the establishing documents for the United States, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and then the Treaty of Paris that brought an end to the war with England. Franklin, of course, known for, having discovered or channeled electricity through flying the kite and so on. He was known as a scientist, an inventor, as a great mind, and indeed he was a brilliant man. You have a number of quotes that are attributed to Franklin. Franklin, who says, "Original sin was as ridiculous as imputed righteousness." Not surprisingly, Benjamin Franklin's view of Christianity was in agreement with the Enlightenment thinkers of Europe. Shortly before he dies, he gets a letter inquiring about his faith and what his view is concerning the Lord Jesus Christ. The following is from a letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote to Ezra Stiles, who was then president of Yale University. "As to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think the system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But I apprehend it has received various corrupt changes, and I have, with most of the present dissenters in England, some doubts as to his divinity." From the first part of his response, Franklin's views about Jesus seem very similar to those of Paine and Jefferson, making reference to corrupt changes in the gospel record. Like many others, he compliments the morality of Christ while rejecting his authority. This was typical of the founding fathers. In the rest of his letter, Benjamin Franklin spoke further about the divinity of Jesus Christ. "It is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it. And I think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble." John Adams was America's second president and first vice president. He worked with Thomas Jefferson in helping to draft the Declaration of Independence. He was a Unitarian and shared views against Christianity, much like the other revolutionaries. He said, "These are what are called revolution principles. They are the principles of Aristotle and Plato, the principles of nature and eternal reason." Adams wrote that the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. In favor of these general principles in philosophy, religion, and government, I could fill sheets of quotations from Rousseau and Voltaire. Voltaire, in particular, wanted the end of Christianity. He wrote that Christianity is the most ridiculous, the most absurd, and bloody religion that has ever infected the world. Adams once wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "I should have given my reason for rejoicing in Voltaire and company. It is because I believe they have done more to propagate religious liberty than Calvin or Luther." Voltaire and Rousseau were so closely associated with the American founders that they are shown in this image beside Benjamin Franklin, as if they all represented the same ideals. But when men like Voltaire spoke about liberty, the freedom they wanted was to be free from Christianity. Even in his lifetime, Adams himself knew full well that his doctrinal views were rejected by Orthodox Christians. He said to them famously, "Ye will say, I am no Christian. I say, ye are no Christians." And there the account is balanced. Adams was a Unitarian, and the Unitarian belief specifically rejects the doctrine of the Christian Trinity. Adams wrote that the Pythagorean as well as the Platonic philosophers probably concurred in the fabrication of the Christian Trinity. Furthermore, Adams did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or that he was God manifest in the flesh. He said, "The Europeans are all deeply tainted with prejudices, which they can never get rid of. They are all infected with creeds and confessions of faith. They all believe that great principle which has produced this boundless universe came down to this little ball to be spit upon by Jews. And until this awful blasphemy is got rid of, there never will be any liberal science in the world." The reason Adams rejected the doctrine that Jesus is God was because of his view that God is unknowable, and therefore, for the Bible to say that the person of God was revealed in Jesus Christ was to him an awful blasphemy. Adams wrote to Jefferson that when we say God is a spirit, we know what we mean. Let us be content, therefore, to believe him to be a spirit, that is, an essence that we know nothing of. But where did Adams get his belief? The pagan origin of his faith was revealed by him in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, where he made reference to an allegedly 5,000-year-old Indian book, the Shasta, the first book of Brahman theology. He said, "Where is to be found theology more orthodox, or philosophy more profound than in the introduction to the Shasta? God is one, creator of all, universal sphere. Search not the essence and the nature of the eternal who is one. Your research will be vain and presumptuous. The eternal willed to communicate of his essence and of his splendor to beings capable of perceiving it. The eternal willed, and he created Burma, Vitsnau, and Sib. These doctrines, Adams says, sublime, if ever there were any sublime, Pythagoras learned in India." It was during the presidency of John Adams that the much-debated Treaty of Tripoli was signed. The treaty bears perhaps the most contrary statement against the idea of the United States as a Christian nation. And the Treaty of Tripoli is, I think, the clearest declaration that the original founders of the United States of America did not believe that they were setting forth a Christian nation. Why? Because they specifically said so in this treaty. And what you have are patriots, diehard patriots, who will try to spin the Treaty of Tripoli and somehow or other state that it doesn't mean what it says. But if you read the entire treaty, there's no reason for them to come right out and say that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. There's no reason to say that if they don't mean it. It was unanimously agreed to on the floor of the Senate. The question, of course, is, well, wait a minute, where were all the Christian founders to leap to their feet and to lift up a shout against this treaty once they heard it? You would think that there would be at least one Christian who would have jumped up and said something. The answer seems to come from a Christian man named Dr. Bird Wilson. And Bird Wilson was somebody who had spent years of his life investigating the faith of the Founding Fathers. In a famously controversial sermon he preached in 1831, Dr. Wilson said, "The founders of our nation were nearly all infidels. When the war was over, the Constitution was framed and God was neglected. He was not merely forgotten, he was absolutely voted out of the Constitution. The proceedings, as published by Thompson, the secretary, show that the question was gravely debated whether God should be in the Constitution or not. And after a solemn debate, he was deliberately voted out of it." Dr. Wilson went on to say that those who have been called to administer the government have not been men making any public profession of Christianity. The absence of Christians in the early American government would explain why no one objected to Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli. According to 19th century historian Moncure D. Conway, the controversial Article 11 was drafted by none other than George Washington. Conway said, "President Washington, the first time he ever came in treaty with a non-Christian people, Tripoli, sent to the Senate a treaty which opened with the following: as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. There is the statement," Conway says, "from the great Washington." The Treaty of Tripoli was drafted toward the end of Washington's presidency and then confirmed under John Adams. If Washington himself authored Article 11, it would further explain why no one would dare to question it. Undoubtedly, the most famous person to have survived the American Revolution is the man known as the father of our country, George Washington. But was he a Christian? Many die-hard patriots would say so. But even during his lifetime, Washington's true faith was a mystery. There are some who put forth about Washington, they'll say that nobody ever questioned his faith in his lifetime, or that nobody ever questioned whether or not he was a Christian in his lifetime. Now, this is provably false. Washington was the President of the United States. And while he was president, he was well known for getting up and walking out of church on Sundays when they did communion. We read that the Reverend Dr. Wilson, in his famous sermon on the religion of the presidents, says, "When the Congress sat in Philadelphia, President Washington attended the Episcopal Church. The rector, Dr. Abercrombie, told me that on the days when the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was to be administered, Washington's custom was to rise just before the ceremony commenced and walk out of the church." We further read that the doubt rests again on the recollection of Nellie Custis, General Washington's step-granddaughter, who states that the general was accustomed on Communion Sundays to leave the church with her, sending the carriage back for Mrs. Washington. The reason Washington sent the carriage back for his wife is because Martha Washington was a regular partaker of communion. And at one point, his pastor, the Reverend Abercrombie, confronted him about how he was setting a bad example for others. In his famous sermon, Dr. Wilson wrote that Washington's refusal to take communion became a subject of remark in the congregation. In a letter, Reverend Abercrombie wrote that, as pastor of the Episcopal Church, observing that on sacramental Sundays, General Washington went out, always leaving Mrs. Washington, I considered it my duty in a sermon to state the unhappy tendency of example, particularly of those in elevated stations who uniformly turn their backs on the celebration of the Lord's Supper. I acknowledge the remark was intended for the President, and as such, he received it. A few days after, a senator told me the President said that he had received a very just reproof from the pulpit for always leaving the church before the administration of the sacrament, and that he would not again give cause for the repetition of the reproof. Accordingly, he never afterwards came on the morning of Sacramental Sunday. Washington's response to this rebuke was to stop going to church on Communion Sunday. While no one would disagree that Washington was a very moral man and a great hero of the Revolution, it was his own pastors, the clergy, who knew him best at a spiritual level. These men, all of them, there were three in particular. You have Bishop White. Bishop White was Washington's pastor for more than 20 years. You have the Reverend James Abercrombie. Abercrombie also knew Washington for many years. Then you have Dr. Ashbel Green. Dr. Green was the congressional chaplain during the 8 years of Washington's presidency and was said to have lunch with the president on a weekly basis. The testimonies of those pastors who knew Washington and what he believed where Christianity is concerned cannot be denied. Perhaps most prominent among these was Bishop William White. He was known as the father of the Protestant Episcopal Church in America and served as chaplain to the Continental Congress. Bishop White ministered to George Washington and his family over a period of more than 20 years. For obvious reasons, many people sought this man, hoping he could give a clear testimony of Washington's Christian belief. His reply on one occasion was, "I do not believe that any degree of recollection will bring to my mind any fact which would prove General Washington to have been a believer in the Christian revelation, further than as may be hoped from his constant attendance upon Christian worship in connection with the general reserve of his character." In other words, beyond the fact that he went to church on a regular basis and was of generally moral character, Bishop White knew of no other proof that George Washington was a Christian. Furthermore, images such as these of Washington kneeling in prayer are famously shown by those who promote the Christian heritage of America. But according to Bishop White, the idea of Washington kneeling reverentially seems to have been greatly exaggerated. In a letter to Reverend Parker of Massachusetts, Bishop White specifically addressed the issue. He wrote, "His behavior in church was always serious and attentive. But as your letter seems to intend an inquiry on the point of kneeling during the service, I owe it to the truth to declare that I never saw him in the said attitude. Although I was often in company with this great man and had the honor of dining often at his table, I never heard anything from him which could manifest his opinions on the subject of religion." Another of Washington's pastors was the Reverend James Abercrombie, who was also sought for an understanding of what George Washington believed. It was Abercrombie who had confronted Washington about turning his back on the Lord's Supper. We read that, long after Washington's death, in reply to Dr. Wilson, who had interrogated him as to his religious views, Dr. Abercrombie's brief but emphatic answer was, "Sir, Washington was a deist." In his diary, Thomas Jefferson wrote, February 1st, Dr. Rush tells me that he had it from Asa Green that when the clergy addressed General Washington on his departure from the government, it was observed in their consultation that he had never on any occasion said a word to the public which showed a belief in the Christian religion. And they thought they should so pen their address as to force him at length to declare publicly whether he was a Christian or not. They did so. However, he observed, the old fox was too cunning for them. He answered every article in their address particularly, except that, which he passed over without notice. I know that Gouverneur Morris has often told me that General Washington believed no more in the system, Christianity, than he did. The quote comes from A.B. Bradford, a relative of Dr. Ashbel Green, or Asa Green, as he was called by Thomas Jefferson. Bradford wrote about what he says Dr. Green had often told him. He explained more at length the plan laid by the clergy of Philadelphia at the close of Washington's administration as president to get his views of religion for the sake of the good influence they supposed they would have in counteracting the infidelity of Paine and the rest of the revolutionary patriots, military and civil. A.B. Bradford continued to relate what Dr. Green had said to him. He confirmed the words of Thomas Jefferson, saying, "But I well remember the smile on his face and the twinkle of his black eye when he said, 'The old fox was too cunning for us.'" He affirmed in concluding his narrative that from his long and intimate acquaintance with Washington, he knew it to be the case that while he respectfully conformed to the religious customs of society by generally going to church on Sundays, he had no belief at all in the divine origin of the Bible or the Jewish Christian religion.